Welcome to the extended watercolour members version of the pink Lotus, which I painted using watercolour pencils. Here are the materials I'll be using. For a full list of materials with Amazon links, please see the description. Here is the gorgeous reference photograph I will be using, but I will be just concentrating on the flower itself. Here is the outline. I've actually drawn it with one of the pink watercolour pencils. If you'd like access to my drawing sketches for the paintings, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Just click the link in the top right hand corner and it will give you more details. The great thing about using watercolour pencils is they are very accessible, easy to use and fun, and you've actually got all the sort of colours already there if you get a large selection of them, or you can just layer on top as well, and I'll be doing some of both. I'm using the Caran watercolour pencil here, sort of like a cadmium yellow, and just putting it in the centre of the flower there, just kind of creating some textured marks as well. I found this bit the trickiest bit actually with this flower, because yellow is such a light colour and then you've got the light petals around it. So I'm trying to give it a little bit more oomph than I would, and sort of adding a little bit more of a raw sienna here to really warm up the centre of the flower. I'm going to build up with the watercolour pencils. This is kind of my first stage, using pinks, reds and violets and some greens for the stem and the leaves. And I'm just putting the pinks mainly at the top of the petals where it's darkest, giving it a little bit of pressure and pressing hard where I want it darker. I'm using Perylene Red and Permanent Magenta, the Rowney colours, but sort of pinks and cool reds at these top sort of edges of the petals here, and just press a little bit harder, but be careful that you don't press so hard that you can't get the watercolour pencil to manoeuvre afterwards. That's where a little bit of practice on a little bit of paper beforehand, just to check what your watercolour pencils do. I find these really good, and when you add water to them they really do sort of dissolve nicely. So I'm just working my way around this lotus flower. A little tip for you as well is kind of work in a sort of, I'm right-handed, so I'm working in a clockwise sort of way, but if you're left-handed you might want to work anti-clockwise, because otherwise I find with the watercolour pencils they get a bit smudgy, because obviously sort of if you've got hand cream on or something like that in your hand, or your hands are warm, it kind of moistens them a little bit as well, so it can get a bit messy. But yeah, I'm just working my way around, just adding some of the pinks and the reds, blending as I go, but don't come down too far because you want to keep the bottom bits of the petals lighter. As I've said before, it's so therapeutic using watercolour pencils. I feel more in control, especially because I'm actually putting down my darks and lights at the very beginning, and you can use those various colours and use colours on top of each other as well to colour mix, and then you add the water later to really sort of blend the colours together. I'm using quite small little blending marks here. You can really sort of adjust the way you sort of apply the pencil. I'm using hot press paper, which is really nice and smooth, and I find that especially doing something detailed like this lotus flower, I find it really nice applying the watercolour pencils too. If you don't have hot press though, you could use cold press paper, but make sure the paper is thick enough that obviously once you start applying water, you could, if it's very thin paper, you can almost sort of wear it out and get a hole in it as well. So I would definitely recommend some sort of watercolour paper for this. So I'm just working my way, just really sort of concentrating on the tips of these flowers, using the pinks, the reds, and maybe a touch of purple here and there. Add a little bit more yellow to the centre there, and I'm using now the Perylene Red and pressing a little bit harder at the tips of the flowers, of the petals here, just to really give it that darkened detail. And I'm just enjoying this so much, just to let you know, it's just, I just feel so much control, and this is something you can just sort of pick up a sketchbook and have a little doodle. But I'm really sort of, this is the kind of the petal that's coming towards us, so it's kind of the star of the show of my petals, if that makes any sense. So I'm giving it a little bit more attention and really sort of looking and observing the tips of the flowers, the way it's sort of, they go in and out, and the shape of the edges. It's not just completely round, there's little indentations here and there, and that's all characteristic of this flower. And it's quite nice just to really look at that and spend time observing the edges of the petals. This little petal here, I would be, if I was honest, gave me the most trouble. I did too much work on it, if I was honest, because it was in the shadow and I was sort of experimenting. I'm doing okay here, but I just overworked it a little bit later. So there we are. You know, these things happen, but it's mostly in the later stages. I just gave it too much shadow. I think sometimes that's a lesson to be learned in watercolour painting in general. It's sometimes if you find yourself working on an area, trying to solve something for too long a time, even if you solve the problem in quotes, you will lose the freshness of the watercolour painting because you've spent too long. So I always find sometimes just leaving it alone, it may not be perfect, but just leaving it alone, remember, less is more. It just looks better, and over time you may look back at the painting and you won't even remember that area if the painting just works because it looks fresh. So I think one of the biggest problems we all have in watercolour painting is knowing when to stop, especially in an area where we're not sure about. So there we are, that's my experience. I've fallen into that trap many a time, so you all have my sympathy. I know exactly how you feel. I'm just working my way round here. If you notice, I don't know if you do notice, I'm getting more confident with these because I don't use them very often, especially not in the last 10 years sort of thing. But as I'm progressing in this painting, I just feel I'm getting my own sense of how to use them and how hard to press, and knowing sort of how to blend with them. And the other thing that I am doing is I'm trying to sort of draw or blend in the plane of that petal. So if you look at the one in the center, the bottom center, the marks are coming down. The marks I'm doing now are almost horizontal, and then I'll curve them round a little bit. So always try to sort of show and describe the shape of the petals by the directional marks that you make with the pencil. I'm just using some very vertical marks here with my light and mid greens, just scribbling on. I did include this leaf here. You don't need to if you don't want to, but I just thought just to show a little bit of description, a little bit of background. And I'm just putting on some lights and mid greens here to show the sort of texture and pattern on the actual surface of the leaf here. So I'm just putting these marks here and there in sort of really in a sort of horizontal strokes, and I'm building up light to dark just how you would in a watercolor painting, and you can blend other colors on top of each other as well. So if you didn't have a dark green, you could actually use a blue and put it on top of a green or even a yellow. So you can just have a little play with blending and mixing colors almost on the watercolor paper. So I'm using a dark green here and gently blending over some of the lighter greens and mid green areas as well, and where the folds are in the leaf I've just built up a little bit of shadow area. And I'm also going to do this on the stem as well, just this dark green here, just scribbling here on the stem just to apply this dark tonal value. I just want to build up a little bit more warmth and tonal values in the center here, so I'm using sort of more like a raw sienna color and even a burnt sienna, just to kind of warm up those yellows there, to really make it look 3D, this flower, by putting these little soft darks in here and there. I'm using a little bit of violet now as well, just to kind of, sort of give a sort of darker pink there, using the violet rather than using, perhaps don't use something like a black or a Payne's grey. It might look too sort of muddy looking. So I recommend maybe using a violet or ultramarine to create shadows on pink petals. So that's the end of this sort of first stage. The next stage, I'm using my size 4 brush and I'm using a little bit of water and just wetting the watercolour pencils to make them become watercolour paint and to reawaken them. So I've done the yellow area in the centre there, and now I'm working on the pink. So I'm just wetting the top darkest part with my size 4 brush. Now I've got lots of water now and I'm pushing it up from the bottom, the lightest area, up to the darkest area. Don't pull down the paint from top to bottom because you'll lose your light. So just be aware of that. But if you do lose your light a little bit, just use a bit of kitchen towel and lift off and take off that paint before it dries. But you can see there I've got lots of clean water and I'm pushing that paint up to the darkest area. And it creates a beautiful dark edge at the top of the petal as well. It's such a nice technique. So I'm working on the next petal. If you're worried about paint bleeding, I find the watercolour pencils paint dries quite quickly, but if you're worried about bleeds, just work on sort of alternate petals and then sort of come back. It gives you enough drying time. So I'm just again pushing the water from bottom to top up to the dark so I don't lose my light. And I'm using the size 4 brush still, and I just love going up to the top here, and it really does give it a little bit of a pop as soon as you reawake or awaken this dark sort of pinks here that I've created and drawn in earlier. And I'm just really making sure that it's all the attention to detail here, these little tips here. I want to make sure I get them just right. So I'm sort of tightening up a little bit here, but I just want to make that sort of pop and, sort of create the characteristic of this lotus flower here. So I'm just using some water now just to sort of get this yellow sort of blending with the very, very pale pink. Always keep rinsing your brush all of the time so you don't end up with orange petals. And use your kitchen towel or an old rag or something just to control the amount of water on your brush. I'm very much a wipe the brush on the side of the pot, but if you find that's too much water or liquid on your brush, just use the kitchen towel to control that. As you saw there, I lost a little bit of my light, so I use the kitchen towel just to lift off. So remember, you can do that while it's still wet. So this is the little tricky petal that you'll see me probably doing a little bit too much fiddling with, but it's still at a safe stage at the moment. But it's an interesting thing actually, because I've done this and I've owned up to it as well. You can just watch me, overworking in a way, and it's a lesson to us all. So that's why I've kept it in. So sharing this with you hopefully will help you sort of stop doing that yourselves. And I have to say though as well, watching myself paint on film has really helped me improve my watercolours. I can just be really critical, almost being the teacher of myself as well. So I'm just lifting off here to get the light. It's all okay at the moment. And one thing I do love teaching. I love looking at other students' work and being very objective. It's always something that I've been sort of, when I say good at, I can just see things that need to be improved. It's very hard to see that yourself sometimes, even in my own work. That's why I found watching the YouTube films that I've made useful for me as well. I can be my teacher, but you can be your teacher as well. You can actually take a photograph using either your phone or a camera and have a look at your painting. You can be very objective and look at it with fresh eyes almost, because it's almost like a different medium. The other thing you can do is put your painting up on a shelf and have a look at it, sort of not straight away, go out, do something, make a cup of tea, but come back and look at it sort of with fresh eyes. And sometimes you can see what needs doing or what doesn't need doing. Sometimes you were going to do something and then you're looking and think, actually, my painting isn't so bad after all. Why am I being so hard on myself? Another tip is to actually show it to a mirror. And especially if you're painting vases or something like that, where it's symmetrical, the mirror doesn't lie as it is, and it kind of shows you where you might need to tweak things. So I hope that you'll find that helpful and, have a go at using those. It can give you a fresh pair of eyes, an honest, fresh pair of eyes. So I'm just making some little marks here on the tip of this little petal here. The watercolour pencil wasn't moving so well, so I had to really tease it. So do spend a bit of time if it's not moving, just kind of really tease it out. It'll get moving eventually, or hopefully. So I'm just working my way round now in this clockwise way, bringing each petal to life. As you've been watching the tutorial here, you'll notice I do use the kitchen towel a lot just to control the sort of the shading on the petal so I don't lose the light. What I'm doing here, actually, this area is quite wet, and as you remember I said earlier, these are kind of the two stars of my little show here, these petals coming forward. So I'm going to use a nice sort of pink colour and just put a little bit more on this damp surface to sort of add a little bit more texture and a darker tone just at the top here to kind of bring it forward to create the illusion of depth here. So I'm using the perylene red and a little bit of violet just to really darken up this left hand petal here, and then just to use some water now just to blend and soften. I'm just painting the stem now using my size 6 brush and just sort of bringing that to life as well. And I worked on the lighter area first. I'm just now reawaking the sort of darker right hand side just to blend those colours. I would say, looking back now, I probably used a little bit too much water there, and it's sort of made it quite flat. So to create that darker edge, use less water. So just wipe that on your kitchen towel. So I hope you find that useful. So I'm just now wetting the leaf as well, working on the lighter colours first and then the darker colours next, and just sort of blending. What I quite like is the texture that watercolour pencils give you when you're wetting them again, because it kind of gives the texture of the leaf here more so than watercolour paint would do, I've found. So I found that really useful and I'm enjoying that. So it's something worth investigating further. So these are the 3 colours I'm going to be using now. I've got my magenta, perylene red and a violet. And I'm just going to use these to create some really nice darks. My painting is dry. I've given it a blow dry, so this is now all dry on dry. So normally I say wet on dry, but it's dry on dry. So I'm just building up some tonal values. And I'm starting with this petal that I had a little bit of a difficulty with here. So far so good. I'm using some of the purple, some of the perylene red, just to build up these sort of darks and details really, as I would in my watercolour painting, and just sort of really sharpening up the edges here. I'm working on the petal behind as well, which is really shaded, and I'm using some of the red. And I actually start using a little bit of brown later as well, a bit of burnt umber with the red, just to really sort of tone it back. But this is the violet, and I'm just blending very softly on this petal behind, because I don't really want to bring it forward, so I've got to kind of keep it quite soft so it pushes back into the background to create depth as well. So I'm using the burnt umber now because I felt the violet and red was coming forward too much, and it just sort of softens that, neutralizes it almost in a way, so you've got the darks but you haven't got too much warmth. So I'm going around now each petal, just putting a little bit more darks on the tips, using the perylene red, burnt umber and the violet, sort of pressing quite hard. Even if you can't move this watercolour pencil later, just those darks will make all the difference. I'm just sharpening my pencil here because I really want a really sharp point to get this detail on the tip of the petals there with the permanent magenta, just to really have a clean line. Don't be afraid to press quite hard with your pinks and violets to create those dark tips. I'm just putting a little bit more shadow now on this, sort of through the centre of the lotus and on this petal coming out as well, pressing quite gently here and there. I thought I'd put a little bit more of the burnt umber into the centre of the flower here, so I'm actually exaggerating what was from the photograph. I'm actually putting more tonal value there just to build up the texture and the darks and the details. So now I'm reawaking this watercolour pencil that I applied, the darkest of the darks, and this is where I get a little bit of trouble here with this petal. I'm using my size 4 brush and I'm just sort of waking up the paint here, and that's quite nice. The dark there, it was that sort of, it's almost like a blue and a violet in there, quite a nice cool dark. So I'm just painting underneath this petal now, just to kind of sort of reawaken the darks here as well. I felt it was a little bit too warm, that pink, it was coming forward a little bit too much. So I should have used a cooler colour like a blue or a violet. So I'm just adding a little bit of blue to that now, just to cool down this shadow colour or the darks here, and putting it a little bit underneath the petal as well. I've got a little bit of burnt umber, I'm applying that also, but I am in the danger area now of overworking this little petal here, as I spoke about earlier. So I'm using my kitchen towel because I'm having a tiny bit of a panic, thinking I'm doing too much. But I think with watercolour pencils, they do sort of almost scar the paper slightly if you overwork them, and there's some marks there that I won't be able to remove now. So lesson learned, I'm really sort of getting to know the sort of the things, to the do's and don'ts, as it were. Now I'm using some Yupo paper here, but you could use some watercolour paper or a shiny sort of paper. But what I've used it for is to create a puddle of paint on the side, like you would use pan. So I put some burnt umber and ultramarine to make a shadow colour. I've added some cooler green now, just to paint some shadows on this wet surface of this petal, just to cool it down, to push it back into the background. But unfortunately, the marks that I made earlier under the petal there are coming forward too much, and there's not a lot I can do, but it's just something to point out to you and to share with you. Even my mistakes, I hope you'll learn from them. So I'm just using my size 4 brush here and just wetting the edge of this petal here. I love the way that curls round and the different sort of variety of colours you can get by overlaying them. I've just taken a little bit of because I tend to over water some of my washes, so I've just taken a little bit of the excess water off there. I'm using again the size 4 brush and just wetting this petal here and just softening those washes. That's the burnt umber and the pink as well. And this hasn't been overworked, it is behind and it gets pushed back. So this is a good example of what you should do. And you can see how that works, and it looks behind those 2 petals. And I'm just darkening up the tip of that there, just a little bit of detail, but I'm quite pleased with how that's worked out. I'm just working my way round each petal, wetting these darks just to bring the edges of the petals to life. I'm using some dark green here to build up some shadows on this leaf here, just to sort of finish off with the darks and the details. Putting a little bit of dark on the right hand side of the stem here to show the light coming from the left. And I'm adding now some water using my size 6 brush, and just sort of getting to blend. You don't want to add too much water that you lose your sort of shadow colour there, so just be careful. Remember again to sort of control the wetness of your brush by wiping off the excess liquid on a piece of paper towel or a rag. And I'm just using some sandpaper there and rubbing it against the pencil to allow the pigment to drop onto the damp paint to create some really nice textures. and I'm just using my size 6 brush with the water now just to build up the dark on the right hand side of the stem there. So I'm using a little bit of indigo, and I'll use some violet as well to create some shadow colours. So it's amazing how you can get a little puddle of paint here. So the harder you press, the more, so the darker the pigment. And here's my violet. I'm just sort of mixing them up together, get a nice puddle. You want it quite sort of dilute. I don't want to lose too much light on my petals, so I'm just applying a little bit of this shadow colour. It was a little bit too dark actually, that's why I added a little bit more water. And I just want to put that here and there on the petals using my size 6 brush. I'm working wet on dry, but I'm using the water as well to dilute that dark. I'm just carefully going around each petal, putting in a little touch of shadow here and there. Just make sure that your painting has dried before you apply this shadow colour. I felt that the shadows were a bit too cool, so I'm actually adding this burnt umber again, and I'm sort of swirling it into the wash there. So you've got sort of the burnt umber, a touch of blue and a touch of violet, and I'm just glazing that on now, some of the sort of the shadows underneath the petals there. And because there's a little bit of warmth to some of those darks as well, and I want to keep it quite light. I don't want to lose, as I said earlier, I don't want to lose the light in this painting. By putting a little bit of shadow on that petal I had problems with, it's just accentuated really the sort of scratch marks left behind from the constant overworking with the watercolour pencils. Because the surface of the paper is wet, I've used a little bit of the sandpaper to sprinkle a little bit of the pink and purples over the top of the damp surface to create some texture. And I'm now dried the painting, and I'm using some of the magenta just to put some markings, some veins on the surface of the petals, sort of dry on dry. So just less is more as well as this. Don't put every mark that you see, just give that little bit of an impression, and maybe some of the petals underneath, don't give them so much attention. Remember, the stars of the show come first, and then your supporting cast, and that actually stops you from overworking and giving too much attention to the background. I decided to use a little bit of pink actually on the centre here, just to create a bit of colour harmony, not like the photograph. I'm going a little bit off-piste as it were, but I think that works quite well. If you have lost your light in the lightest parts, just use some white gouache and paint it wet on dry using a size 6 brush, and just sort of putting it where you need a little bit of the light. There's no shame in it, and it can bring a perfectly good painting, to life by just getting back a little bit of that light. I've decided to give the painting a little splatter, and as you see, I did a little bit over that petal that I wasn't very pleased with, so it's kind of a distraction, which works quite well in my favour here. So there are ways of getting around things, believe it or not. I've made a little bit of a sort of drawing with the pink there, making a puddle, and a little bit more there, pressing harder because it was a bit too pale, and I'm just going to spatter some of this pink onto the surface. And there, and even in the background, just to give it a little bit of texture to finish off. Or you could use the tip of your watercolour pencil, wet it as you see I'm doing there, and get some of that neat pigment and spatter that as well to finish off. And it gives it that little sparkle that I love at the end of the painting. It just keeps me nice and loose. So here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learnt something, not just from the techniques I use, but some of the mistakes that I made and how I try to rectify them with a little splatter here and there, and using the white paint. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below, and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And if you'd like to share your work, remember you can share it on the members Facebook page, and details about that will be in the description below. Thank you so much for being part of the memberships. I really appreciate the support that you've given me this year, and for your continued support. Happy painting. Bye for now.